The name slipped from Muhammad Salah's lips before he could stop himself. He stood frozen on the rain-slicked pavement, staring into the dimly lit alley where a frail figure huddled against a stack of torn cardboard boxes. The damp air carried the sharp scent of alcohol, decaying food, and something else, something like forgotten time. The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes, dulled by exhaustion, flickered with recognition. His lips trembled as if trying to form words that had been lost for years. Salah? A gust of wind rushed through the alley, cutting through the silence like a blade. Muhammad swallowed hard. This was impossible. This was Mr. Dowd, the man who once commanded a stage with thunderous passion. The teacher who had shaped him, pushed him beyond his limits, taught him to wield emotion like a weapon on stage. The man who had once said, "Feel with your heart, not just your words." But now he was just another ghost of the city, a past buried in dust. Muhammad's mind raced back to the dusty theater of his school, where Mr. Dowd had once stood tall, guiding his students with fiery intensity. Back then, his voice carried power, demanding presence, extracting raw emotion from even the shyest performers. How had he ended up here? And why did it feel like this wasn't just a stroke of bad luck, but something much darker? Unanswered questions. Muhammad crouched beside him, ignoring the wet grime soaking into his jeans. "Mr. Dowd, what happened to you?" His voice was steady, but his chest felt tight. For a long moment, the older man just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, in a whisper barely louder than the rain, he said something that sent a shiver down Muhammad's spine. "They took everything." A cold dread settled in Muhammad's stomach. "Who?" Mr. Dowd's eyes darted around the alley, as if the shadows themselves were listening. His voice dropped lower. "They'll come for me again." And then he slumped forward, unconscious. Muhammad barely caught him before his head hit the pavement. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Whatever had happened to Mr. Dowd, it wasn't over, and now Muhammad was part of it. The words echoed in Muhammad Salah's mind as he struggled to keep Mr. Dowd upright. The old man's body was limp, his breathing shallow. Rain dripped from his unkempt hair, rolling down his gaunt cheeks like silent tears. Muhammad clenched his jaw. He had two choices: walk away, pretend he never saw this, or step into the unknown. His grip tightened. There was no choice. At a desperate escape, Muhammad slung Mr. Dowd's frail arm over his shoulder, his muscles straining as he lifted the man to his feet. The alley was quiet, too quiet. Even in the heart of London, the absence of sound felt unnatural, like the city itself was holding its breath. At a flicker of movement caught his to the alley's entrance. A dark figure stood beneath a broken street lamp. Watching. Muhammad's pulse quickened. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a silhouette against the night. Instinct kicked in. Muhammad turned, half carrying, half dragging Mr. Dowd deeper into the alley, away from the unknown presence. His footsteps splashed against puddles, heart pounding with every step. A low hum filled the at first. He thought it was the wind. But no, it was deliberate, a vibration, like a phone left on silent mode. Then the street lamp overhead flickered and died. Darkness swallowed them whole. Fragments of a broken manthe reached a side street. Muhammad spotted a taxi idling at the curb and wasted no time yanking the door open. "Get us out of here," he ordered, voice sharp with urgency. The driver glanced at Mr. Dowd's unconscious form, but said nothing. With a nod, he pulled away from the curb. Inside the cab, the smell of damp leather and stale cigarette smoke filled the air. Muhammad adjusted Mr. Dowd's position, checking his pulse. Weak, but steady. "Mr. Dowd," he murmured, shaking him gently. "Who are you afraid of?" The old man stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, glassy with exhaustion and fear. "Not here," he rasped. "They listen." Muhammad felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who listens?" Mr. Dowd swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the taxi's rearview mirror. They never stopped watching. Muhammad followed his line of sight. The driver's eyes met his through the mirror, expressionless, cold. Then the car took an unexpected turn, not toward Muhammad's apartment, not toward any place he recognized. Something was very, very wrong that Muhammad's voice cut through the tense silence of the cab. The driver didn't answer. Outside, the neon lights of London blurred past, but the streets were unfamiliar. They weren't heading toward his apartment, nor any safe place he could recognize. That Muhammad's grip tightened around Mr. Dowd's frail body. The old man was still weak, but his fingers dug slightly into Muhammad's sleeve, almost as if he knew. The driver's hands were steady on the wheel, too steady. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, the driver finally spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped in that alley." A trap unfolds. Muhammad's heart pounded, but he glanced at the locked doors. The cab's digital meter was dead. The windows were tinted just enough to distort the view from outside. IT wasn't a taxi. IT was a trap. Mr. Dowd coughed weakly, trying to lift his head. "Don't let them take me," he whispered. Muhammad's instincts kicked in. Think. Act. Fast. He eyed the divider between the front and back seats. Reinforced, no easy way through. The door locks, automatic, but maybe he could force them. The car was picking up speed. He had seconds. With one swift motion, Muhammad lunged forward, grabbing the driver's shoulder with a forceful yank. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. "Stop the Sayar!" Muhammad roared. The driver didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket. Flash of metal. Gun. Breaking point before the driver could react, Muhammad did the only thing he could think of. He slammed his elbow into the side of the driver's head, sending the car spinning. The world blurred. Headlights flashed. A horn blared. Then, impact, a bone-rattling crash as the car slammed into a lamppost. Glass shattered. Metal groaned. For a second, there was nothing but silence. Then, the driver stirred. Muhammad didn't wait. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, he kicked the door open, pulling Mr. Dowd out with him. The old man groaned but clung to Muhammad's arm. Footsteps. The driver was getting out. Muhammad turned, adrenaline surging. A black SUV rounded the corner, fast. Headlights blinding, more of them. Mr. Dowd gripped his wrist, his voice urgent despite his weakness. "Run." Mr. Dowd's whisper was barely audible over the ringing in Muhammad's ears, but the urgency in his voice sent an instant jolt through his body. The black SUV roared toward them, its headlights blinding in the rain-soaked street. The driver of the wrecked taxi was already staggering to his feet, blood trickling from his temple. Too many threats. No time. Muhammad gritted his teeth, tightened his grip around Mr. Dowd, and sprinted. The cold night air burned his lungs as he dragged the old man down a narrow side street, their footsteps slapping against the wet pavement. The sound of screeching tires followed. Whoever these people were, they weren't giving up. Hunted in the dark, they ran through a labyrinth of alleys, turning blindly, stumbling over debris. Somewhere behind them, doors slammed. More footsteps. More shadows. They weren't just being followed. They were being hunted. Mr. Dowd's breath was ragged. His legs were weak. Muhammad could feel the old man faltering, but stopping wasn't an option. Ahead, a rusted metal gate blocked their path. Muhammad didn't think. He acted. In one swift motion, he hoisted Mr. Dowd over the gate, then pulled himself up just as a voice rang out behind them. "Stop." A gunshot exploded into the night. The bullet ricocheted off the metal just inches from his hand. The safe house? They landed hard on the other side. Muhammad barely took a second to breathe before yanking Mr. Dowd forward. The old man's face was pale, drenched in sweat. There, Mr. Dowd pointed weakly at a door to an old, abandoned storefront with its windows boarded up. In no time to question. Muhammad shoved it open and pulled them both inside. Darkness swallowed them whole. The sound of the street faded behind them. No headlights, no voices. For now, they were hidden. But Muhammad knew. This wasn't over. He turned to Mr. Dowd, his voice low, demanding. "Who are they?" The old man leaned back against the wall, eyes flickering with something between exhaustion and fear. And then, finally, he answered, "The ones who erased me." Muhammad felt a chill crawl down his spine. The words lingered in the darkness of the abandoned shop like a ghost refusing to fade. Outside, the distant roar of the SUV's engine faded into the night. For now, they were safe. But how long before those men found them again? He turned toward Mr. Dowd, whose breath was uneven, his frail body slumped against the wall. The dim light from the street barely reached his hollowed-out face, making him look even more like a shadow of the man he once was. Who are they? Muhammed pressed. Mr. Dowd exhaled shakily, closing his eyes for a moment. People who don't exist. People who erase others to make sure they don't exist either. A beat of silence. Then he looked directly at Muhammad. They will come for you now. A name that shouldn't be spoken. Muhammad clenched his fists, his pulse still racing from the chase. I don't understand. Why would they come after me? He stopped himself. He was just walking home. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Or was he? Mr. Dowd studied him carefully. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said a name that made the air itself feel heavier. Kareem Zaid. Muhammad frowned. Who is that? Mr. Dowd's lips pressed into a thin line. The man who destroyed my life. A gust of wind rattled the boarded-up windows, making the entire shop groan as if it, too, feared that name. Pieces of a buried truth. Muhammad ran a hand through his damp hair, his thoughts racing. Tell me everything, he said firmly. Mr. Dowd hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet that Muhammad had to lean in to hear, he began. I used to be more than a teacher. Before the school, before everything, I was part of something much bigger. A theater group? Yes, but not just for art. We were messengers. We told stories the government wanted buried. And Kareem Zaid, he was the one who made sure we disappeared. Muhammad's heart pounded harder. Mr. Dowd swallowed. They took my friends. They burned our scripts. They made sure no one remembered what we stood for. And when I ran, they hunted me, forced me into the streets, erased my name, my past, my future. His fingers clenched into a weak fist. But now they know I'm still alive. No way back. Muhammad exhaled slowly. He had come into this night thinking he'd just help an old teacher in need. But now he was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. Something deadly. A sudden noise outside made both of them freeze. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Then, a knock at the door. Muhammad and Mr. Dowd locked eyes. Whoever was they had found them. Muhammad felt a chill crawl down his spine. The words lingered in the darkness of the abandoned shop like a ghost refusing to fade. Outside, the distant roar of the SUV's engine faded into the night. For now, they were safe. But how long before those men found them again? He turned toward Mr. Dowd, whose breath was uneven, his frail body slumped against the wall. The dim light from the street barely reached his hollowed-out face, making him look even more like a shadow of the man he once was. Who are they? Muhammad pressed. Mr. Dowd exhaled shakily, closing his eyes for a moment. People who don't exist. People who erase others to make sure they don't exist either. A beat of silence. Then he looked directly at Muhammad. They will come for you now. A name that shouldn't be spoken. Muhammad clenched his fists, his pulse still racing from the chase. I don't understand. Why would they come after me? He stopped himself. He was just walking home. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Or was he? Mr. Dowd studied him carefully. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said a name that made the air itself feel heavier. Kareem Zaid. Muhammad frowned. Who is that? Mr. Dowd's lips pressed into a thin line. The man who destroyed my life. A gust of wind rattled the boarded-up windows, making the entire shop groan as if it, too, feared that name. Pieces of a buried truth. Muhammad ran a hand through his damp hair, his thoughts racing. Tell me everything, he said firmly. Mr. Dowd hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet that Muhammad had to lean in to hear, he began. I used to be more than a teacher. Before the school, before everything, I was part of something much bigger. A theater group, yes, but not just for art. We were messengers. We told stories the government wanted buried. And Kareem Zaid, he was the one who made sure we disappeared. Muhammad's heart pounded harder. Mr. Dowd swallowed. They took my friends. They burned our scripts. They made sure no one remembered what we stood for. And when I ran, they hunted me, forced me into the streets, erased my name, my past, my future. His fingers clenched into a weak fist. But now they know I'm still alive. No way back, Muhammad exhaled slowly. He had come into this night thinking he'd just help an old teacher in need. But now, he was part of something much bigger, something dangerous, something deadly. That a sudden noise outside made both of them freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a knock at the door. Muhammad and Mr. Dowd locked eyes. Whoever it was, they had found them. The words sent a shiver down Muhammad's spine. Lying flat on the wooden beams above, he barely dared to breathe. Below, the three men moved with terrifying precision. No hesitation, no wasted movements. They weren't searching like common thugs. They were professionals. Mr. Dowd lay beside him, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. His old frame trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, locked onto the shadows moving beneath them. That a single mistake, a creak, a breath too loud, could be the end. The hunt begins. One of the men, a tall figure with a shaved head, tapped his ear. Clear the alley. Watch for movement on the rooftops, he said, his voice laced with quiet authority. Muhammad swallowed hard. They weren't just checking inside. They were locking down the entire area. The second man ran a gloved hand across the dust-covered furniture, examining the untouched surfaces. He turned toward the leader. No one's been here long. They must still be inside. A heavy silence. Then, check the ceiling. Muhammad's pulse spiked. He met Mr. Dowd's eyes. They were wide with fear. Then, a flashlight beam swept across the wooden ceiling. That a desperate move. Muhammad didn't think. He acted. With a single, fluid motion, he grabbed a loose plank from the beam and hurled it toward the far side of the room. Crash. The wood splintered as it struck a rusted shelf, sending metal tumbling to the floor. There, one of the men shouted, spinning toward the noise. That it was their only chance. Muhammad seized Mr. Dowd's arm, pulling him toward the open panel in the ceiling. Without hesitation, they crawled through, emerging onto the roof of the building. Cold night air hit them like a slap. Rain slicked the worn concrete, making every step a risk. Time to be careful. Behind them, muffled voices cursed in frustration. Then, gunfire. Bullets ripped through the wooden beams where they had just been. The rooftop chase. Muhammad dragged Mr. Dowd forward. They sprinted across the rooftop, slipping and stumbling over loose tiles. At a second building loomed ahead, separated by a narrow alley. Muhammad's gut twisted. It was at least a 15-foot gap. Too far for Mr. Dowd. The old man knew it, too. He stopped short, chest heaving. Go, he panted. You can make it. Muhammad whirled around, shaking his head. I'm not leaving you. The rooftop door behind them burst open. The men were coming. Muhammad's mind raced. He looked around, searching. There, a rusted fire escape clung to the side of the building, just a few feet below. Hold on, he told Mr. Dowd, gripping the man's arm tightly. Then, without warning, he jumped, taking Mr. Dowd with him, and escaped. The impact sent pain jolting up his legs, but they landed. The fire escape groaned under their weight, rust flakes crumbling beneath their feet. Above them, the men skidded to a halt at the rooftop's edge. They're cornered. One of them muttered. Muhammad's breath was ragged. They had escaped for now, but the men weren't retreating. They were waiting because they knew something Muhammad didn't. And when he looked down at the alley below, his stomach dropped. The second black SUV was already there, waiting for them. They were trapped. Muhammad's mind raced. Above them, the killers stood at the rooftop's edge, watching like hunters cornering their prey. Below, the black SUV idled, its engine humming like a beast ready to strike at Mr. Dowd clutched the railing, his breath labored. His body was barely holding on. They had seconds. Muhammad's eyes darted across the alley. Brick walls, dumpsters, a locked gate, no clear way out, and then a flicker of movement from a side street. A figure, hooded, watching. Then a sharp whistle, short, deliberate. Muhammad tensed. Friend or foe? Before he could decide, the rooftop gunman made the choice for him. Take them now. The drop a single shot cracked through the air. Muhammad yanked Mr. Dow down just as the bullet shattered the rusted railing beside them. The fire escape groaned under the impact. IT wasn't going to hold. With no time to think, Muhammad gripped Mr. Dowd and did the only thing left. He jumped. They crashed onto a pile of stacked cardboard boxes in the alley below. Pain exploded through Muhammad's shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and pulled himself up. The SUV's doors flew open. Two men in black suits emerged, moving fast. In no time, the hooded figure from the shadows stepped forward. "Follow me if you want to live." Muhammad didn't hesitate. He hoisted Mr. Dowd to his feet and ran. The stranger's gambit, the hooded figure led them through a maze of back streets, twisting through the city like they knew every inch of it. Behind them, shouts erupted. Footsteps thundered. The men were closing in. Muhammad stole a glance at the stranger. "Who the hell are you?" The figure didn't look back. "Someone who doesn't want you dead." Not exactly comforting. They rounded a corner, and suddenly, a dead end. Muhammad skidded to a halt. "Are you kidding me?" The stranger turned, finally pulling back their hood. A woman. Dark eyes, sharp features. A scar ran along her jawline. And something else, something familiar. Muhammad's breath caught. "I know you," he whispered. She smirked. "Not yet, but you will." Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small detonator. Before Muhammad could react, she pressed the button. Boom. The alley wall behind her collapsed, revealing a hidden tunnel. Smoke filled the air. The men chasing them stopped short, shielding their faces from the dust. The woman grabbed Muhammad's arm. "Move! Now!" He didn't argue to they disappeared into the tunnel. The last thing Muhammad saw was the silhouette of the gunmen standing frozen in the smoke. They weren't just escaping. They were going somewhere the enemy didn't expect. But where? And more importantly, who was this woman? Muhammad's voice echoed through the narrow tunnel as they ran. The air was thick with dust from the explosion, and the only light came from flickering emergency lamps bolted to the walls. Mr. Dowd stumbled, gasping for breath, but the mysterious woman grabbed his arm, keeping him steady. "We don't have time for introductions," she said sharply. Muhammad grabbed her wrist, yanking her to a stop. "We're not taking another step until you tell me what's going on." The woman exhaled, irritated. "Fine. My name is Lena, and if we don't keep moving, we're all dead." She wrenched her arm free and kept walking. A history buried in ashes. Muhammad exchanged a look with Mr. Dowd, then followed. The tunnel was old, too old. The walls were lined with faded Arabic script, remnants of something long abandoned. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Finally, Lena stopped at a rusted metal door and pulled out a key. Muhammad's patience snapped. "You knew we were coming," he said. "You were waiting for us." Lena glanced at him. "Not for you. For him." She nodded toward Mr. Dowd. The old man's face paled. "You were part of the theater group," he whispered. Lena's expression darkened. "I was what came after it." She turned the key, and the door creaked open. The hidden resistance beyond the door lay a dimly lit room, cluttered with maps, photographs, and old computer monitors. A single flag, torn but unmistakable, hung on the wall. It was the emblem of a movement Muhammad had only heard rumors about, the Ashes. A resistance group. One that was supposed to have been wiped out years ago. Lena turned to face them. "You want the truth?" Her eyes locked onto Mr. Dowd. "Kareem Zaid didn't just erase you. He erased all of us." Mr. Dowd's hands trembled. "You survived." Lena nodded. "Barely." She gestured to the maps on the table. Red circles marked key locations across the city. "Zaid isn't just a man. He's an operation. He's still out there, still pulling the strings." Muhammad stepped closer. "And you think we can stop him?" Lena's lips curled into a dangerous smile. "We already started." No more running. A sudden noise crackled through a nearby radio. Static. Then a voice. "We found the tunnel. Moving in." Lena's smile vanished. "Looks like your friend's caught up." She tossed Muhammad a pistol. "Time to see if you're just a footballer or something more." Muhammad stared at the weapon in his hand. He had spent his whole life avoiding fights. But now, there was no more running. He cocked the gun. The radio crackled again, static laced with urgency. Footsteps echoed through the tunnel outside. The enemy was closing in, Muhammad tightened his grip on the pistol. His fingers felt foreign around the cold metal. He had never held a gun before, let alone fired one. Lena, however, moved like she had done this 100 times. She slid her rifle off the table and checked the magazine. "They think we're trapped," she muttered. "Let's prove them wrong." Mr. Dowd, breathless but steady, placed a hand on Muhammad's shoulder. His voice was quiet but firm. "You don't have to fight." Muhammad met his gaze. "Yes, I do." The first man stepped into the doorway. Lena moved first, a single shot to the leg. The man collapsed with a scream, his rifle clattering to the floor. The second attacker hesitated, just long enough for Muhammad to act that he moved. Not like a fighter. Like a footballer, he lunged forward, ducking low, sweeping the fallen rifle with his foot and kicking it out of reach. The hesitation cost their enemy everything. Lena took the second man down with ruthless efficiency. But more were coming out of truth unveiled as they ran deeper into the underground hideout. Muhammad's mind raced. They had survived. But why? Why were they being hunted with such intensity? Why was Mr. Dowd still alive after all these years? Then he saw an old file on the table, marked with a name, Muhammad Salah. His blood ran cold. "What is this?" he demanded. Lena's face was unreadable. "You were never just some footballer." Muhammad's hand shook as he flipped open the file. Old photos. Reports. His name. His face. Years before he had even become famous. "You were supposed to be erased too," Lena said. "But someone protected you. Someone made sure you lived a normal life." His stomach twisted. "Ooh." Lena hesitated. Then, boom, the tunnel behind them exploded. Dust and fire swallowed the passage, cutting off their escape. The last Stanmore men were coming. They had only seconds to act. Lena grabbed a second detonator. "There's another way out," she shouted over the chaos. "But you have to trust me." Muhammad's mind spun. Nothing made sense. But at this moment, none of that mattered. He glanced at Mr. Dowd, then back at Lena, and he nodded. Lena hit the switch. The world turned to fire. Epilogue. A new game begins. When the smoke cleared, they were gone. The enemy searched, but they found no bodies. No trace. Only one thing remained. Muhammad's old football jersey, lying in the rubble, that a message, that a warning. Muhammad Salah was no longer just a footballer, he was a ghost. And ghosts don't stop until the game is over.